Welcome to The Gaze. I'm glad to be with you on a digital platform of New Europe, platform where we will show you all these significant events on different regions that at the end of the day affects the world globally, and we will speak about it with our experts for you. I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and it's my show, Talk for More Details, and today we will speak about Russia, its mentality, and lessons from the history. And I'm very glad to present our today's guest. It's Alexander Motyl, professor of political science at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, and a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. So nice to have you on our program. Hello.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and an honor as well.
Thank you for your time. And for the start, I want to add some new decisions that were made by our Верховна Rada, and then we will discuss it with you, if you don't mind. So, the Верховна Rada of Ukraine in early May introduced the word Russism into the legislation. In the text of the documents, the deputies of the Верховна Rada collected the characteristics of the current Russian government. And I quote, "The war unleashed by Russia in Ukraine demonstrated to the world the essence of the political regime of Vladimir Putin as a neo-imperial totalitarian dictatorship that follows the worst practices of the past and embodies the ideas of fascism and National Socialism in the modern version of Russian fascism." The explanatory note specifies also the Ukrainian parliamentaries are planning to appeal to the international community with a proposal to declare the political regime in Russia as Russism. So first of all, what parallels can be drawn in the historical context today, taking into account the pattern of the formation of both regimes and the mechanism of disruption of the world order, both in the last century and right now? Mr. Motyl, what do you say about it?
Well, it's been my view since around 2008. So for a good 15 years, I've been arguing that Russia, the political system in Russia, is very similar to those in Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. And I've openly called the system fascistoid, which is to say almost fascist. And then around 2015, 2016, I've been arguing that it is actually fascist. And of course, since the war began last year, there is, I think, absolutely no question in my mind, and increasingly in the minds of other academics, that fascism is the correct term for Russia. And of course, Russism is essentially just a combination of those two words, Russian fascism. Why is the Russian system fascist? There are various definitions of the word. There's lots of disputation, contention. People agree, they disagree. One of the reasons why people are wary about using the term fascist is because it's become a political term as much as it's an academic and a kind of neutral term. But it seems to me that it's a very legitimate term, and it's a term that describes a particular kind of political system. So in a fascist system, the minimal requirements of any fascist system is that the political system be authoritarian, possibly totalitarian, led by a dictator, and very importantly, there has to be a cult of personality surrounding the dictator. The dictator isn't just some kind of gray person who happens to be pulling the strings. The dictator presents himself, possibly herself, as somehow the embodiment of the nation, all wise, all vigorous. And if we look at Nazi Germany, we look at Mussolini's Italy, and when we compare those two to Putin's Russia, we find that they all share those characteristics. Now, of course, in some respects, These countries differ in most, but in the key respects, they're actually quite similar. They mobilize people, they're intolerant, they use violence, but that, of course, has everything to do with the fact that they are dictatorial, authoritarian, and totalitarian systems. Now, they also have an inclination. We see that historically in the case of Germany and Italy, and we see that also in the case of the Russian Federation. They have an inclination, indeed a requirement, arguably, to engage in imperialism, to engage in war. Sometimes the war is just a rationale for the dictatorship. It's a justification of the dictatorship, because very often they will argue that the world is opposed to them. They will argue that they are in possession of some kind of ultimate truth about the nature of reality. And we see that in Italy, Germany, as in Russia. But very often, of course, they also have imperial or imperialist agendas. They want to be glorious, be powerful. They want to present an image of glory and power to the world.
Слава героям Отечественной войны! Ура!
And this is where the personality cult comes into play, because fascist leaders always present themselves as being all-powerful, all-glorious, all-knowing. And of course, very often, especially as in the case of Mussolini and Putin, they present themselves as being very hyper-masculine. They're macho, they're virile, they're strong. We see that in the photographs that were taken of Mussolini. We see that in the photographs of Putin. So there's always a cult. There's always a cult of youth, of vigor, of strength, of glory, of power, things of that sort. And again, we see that in all these regimes. So it seems to me fairly obvious that these regimes can all be termed fascist. And in the case of the Russian regime, I think the word Russism applies. But as long as we're aware of the fact that what we're essentially talking about is that Russism is simply the Russian equivalent of fascism, another kind of fascism that was practiced in Nazi Germany, as well as in Mussolini's Italy.
And by the way, you mentioned one more peculiarity that can be in one line with the Nazi Germany. It's the thing that is very good historical parallel. It's dedicated to the cruelty towards the civilian population. So in your opinion, is this a direct influence, especially of propaganda during all these years before the start of full-scale invasion to Ukraine, or it's still a complex of circumstances that are maybe compatible with the current effects of Russian propaganda and its goals that it was in previous century and for now, because we have a huge difference in an informational environment and field. So in the previous century, they had only the opportunity of newspaper and maybe radio to spread the propaganda. But now we live in the informational environment, but still people like blind and deaf just sitting like a zombie at the television and listen whatever the propagandist says. So is that the complex problem, or it's still Goebbels propaganda that works through the centuries?
Well, in the case of, again, keep in mind that every authoritarian regime, every fascist regime has to employ propaganda. It's just part and parcel of the very essence of these regimes, for the very simple reason that they're always manipulating their populations. Since these regimes are generally ineffective politically and economically, or at least in the long run, they need to be able to brainwash the population, and they need to be able to coerce the population. So it's not surprising that they engage in political repression, assassinations, concentration camps, prisons. Now, again, there are varying degrees. So the Nazis were extreme, Stalinist Russia was extreme, but you find that in all these regimes. In terms of the propaganda, obviously, again, there's a continuity in the sense that whether it was Goebbels or whether it was Mussolini or whether it was Stalin, Brezhnev, or Putin, propaganda was essential to the maintenance of these regimes because you have to be able to manipulate people, but at the same time, keep in mind that these regimes always have some kind of transformational goal. They want to create the new German, the new Italian, the new Russian, the new Soviet, right? The new Soviet man, the new Soviet person, the new Russian person, the turbo patriot, the Z patriot. These are always the goals of these sorts of regimes. I mean, they want, on the one hand, simply to stay in power, but at the same time, they realize that in order to stay in power and to succeed, they need to change the mentality of their populations. So, in that sense, they try to control whatever key media that influence the people. So in the 1930s, that was radio, of course, because essentially that was the only means. Well, radio and, of course, newspapers, magazines. In the 1940s and 1950s, television came into its own. And as you can see, it's still very important. Certainly the majority of the population in the Russian Federation gets its news from official television stations. But at the same time, thanks to the internet, there are these alternative media. But it's precisely because of the fact that the internet is, in principle, it's difficult to control. It comes from everywhere. On the other hand, it can be limited, it can be controlled. The Chinese regime does a very effective job of doing that. Putin tries to do the same thing. But at the same time, is he succeeding? And this is a very interesting question because, as you know, the popularity ratings of the key Russian propagandists like Solovyov, Skabeyeva, Simonyan appear to be declining significantly. So people seem to be getting tired of this kind of propaganda. At the same time, Russians seem to be more interested and willing to listen to the internet. And I think one indication of the fact that the Putin regime is somewhat worried was the recent meeting that Putin had with the military bloggers. And these are people who have no particular status within Russian society. Many of them are simply working on the internet on the basis of their own initiative. And yet Putin devotes a substantial amount of time to an extended meeting with these people who have no official standing. And I think that's the recognition of the fact that he appreciates that the internet is becoming increasingly important and that his regime is not doing quite an adequate job in controlling it. And it may be that it's just impossible ultimately to control it, given YouTube, given Telegram and things like that. But clearly something is taking place, and there seems to be an awareness on the part of the regime that it has to do more in order to get its message across. And of course, part of the reason for that is that even Russians, even those who think just a little, not necessarily a lot, but just a little, have to be aware of the fact that the war isn't going quite like it was supposed to. They may see no alternatives to the war. They may see no alternatives to Putin, but some of them increasingly have to be aware of the fact that the war, which was supposed to take 3 days, is now taking 16, 17 months. Well, something is wrong with the picture. Something is wrong with the official propaganda line.
But actually,
or at least what
they actually try to find the explanation each time that the answer is appearing in the audience, why it's so long time it takes this operation. But anyways, we have some additional social analyzed data that we will discuss a little bit later. But you mentioned about the internet, so we have a chance to talk to artificial intelligence and to ask it what it thinks about the common features between the state policy of modern Russia and Germany in the 1930s. So we asked ChatGPT what he thinks or what it thinks about it. So here's what we got, the answers. So while there may be some similarities between the state policies of modern Russia and Germany in the 1930s, it is important to note that they are distinct historical periods with different contexts. So the following are some general aspects that could be considered as common features, although they should be approached with caution and not overgeneralized. So strong central governments, both modern Russia and Germany in the 1930s, exhibited a strong emphasis on centralization of power within the government. In both cases, the state sought to exert a significant control over various aspects of society. In this point, I want to ask you what is different in this aspect, because we understand that there were some ideology at Nazi Germany, at Hitler's administration of the country. But in this situation in Russia, we understand there are different groups of interest, and one of them, and leading one during all these years, it's a huge business or oligarchs, I'm sorry, how we call it. So is a difference between Nazi Germany and Putin's Russia right now in this aspect?
Well, in terms of oligarchs, actually, no. If you look at Nazi Germany, the huge corporations continued to exist, private property continued to exist, and many of these huge corporations continued to produce what they were producing, whether it was cars or steel or other kinds of machinery. And the same thing happens to be true within the Russian Federation. What is striking is the fact that private property and private businesses, huge businesses, still exist in both countries. At the same time, in both countries, the state was able to control these corporations and these businesses, which is essentially what you find today in the Russian Federation. The oligarchs are there. They're still multi-billionaires. They're not going away. And they have to do essentially what Putin and the central authorities tell them what to do. And the same was true in Nazi Germany. The same was also true in Fascist Italy. It's not as if these countries became communist, abolished private property, and abolished private corporations. So the similarities are actually quite striking, even in this particular point of view.
Okay, let's take a look at another aspect, as we already discussed a little bit. It's nationalism. So, nationalistic sentiments were present in both eras, GPT chat writes us. Germany during the 1930s saw the rise of extreme nationalism under Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime, while modern Russia under President Vladimir Putin has promoted a sense of Russian national identity and pride. In this case, I want to ask you, what's the difference between two ideologies, and can we call this ideology as well, what is going on in Russia right now? Because when we look back at the history of Nazi Germany, at that time, they had something to be proud of. I mean, the economy of the country started to rise, so people got the opportunity to find jobs and to develop somehow. So in this case of Russia, we see just decrease in the economy and all that, but they still are proud. What they're proud of, and is that the ideology?
Well, I mean, again, you're asking two questions. One is the question of pride, and the other one is about ideology. So let me address both of them separately. In terms of pride, again, remember the Germans in the 1930s, yes, their economy improved, and in the case of the Russians, their economy is declining. But that wasn't the core of German pride. Or Russian pride. The core of the pride consisted in the fact that both regimes said that they would make Germany, and in this case Russia, great again. Right? Both countries had been humiliated. In the case of Germany, it was World War I. It was the case of hyperinflation, economic collapse, cultural confusion in the 1920s. And Germany, which was supposed to be this leading nation, the nation of philosophers and thinkers and poets, had suddenly become this miserable little country that was being exploited by democracies and everybody else. And essentially, Putin is making the same claim. He made this claim 20 years ago when he came to power, and he's still saying the same. I will make Russia great again. We were humiliated when the Soviet Union fell apart. We were humiliated during the Yeltsin years. The Democrats are at fault, and this is exactly the same thing that the Nazis said in Germany, that the Democrats were at fault. The Jews were at fault. Now, in the case of Russia, it's obviously not the Jews, it's the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are the ones who are bringing catastrophe to Russia. So in that sense, the pride has the same focus in both countries. It's pride in the endless, the boundless, the magnificent, the historically unique civilization that is Germany, and the equivalent in the Russian case. And in both cases, the pride isn't just a function of propaganda. It's not as if Hitler or Putin were the first to say that their countries, their nations are somehow unique civilizations. I mean, this was part and parcel of German and Russian political culture for centuries. So what Hitler and Putin have managed to do is they've mobilized this political culture that was there for many years, and to build on it, and to utilize it, to exploit it in order to persuade people that the period of humiliation was over, and now we are entering a new age. So the pride is exactly the same, and the ideological focus in that respect is the same as well. Now, in terms of nationalism or ideology more generally, what is characteristic of fascist regimes, and this is true of Nazi Germany, Italy, as well as of Putin's Russia, is they do have a kind of ideological tendency, but they don't have a coherent ideology in the way that the Soviet Union had. The Soviet Union had an ideological answer for every single question. It was a very complex ideology. It encompassed all of reality. In the case of the fascists, their ideology is much simpler. It consists of the fact that the nation is glorious. It consists of the fact that the leader is always right. It consists of the fact that we need to work very hard for the glory of the nation and the state, right? So it has these components, but they don't amount to a complex, fully ramified and systematic ideological worldview. And in that sense, again, Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Putin's Russia are very, very similar. They have these sorts of ideological leanings, but they pretty much focus on the same three or four things. The infallible leader, the glorious nation, and the powerful, invincible state. And that's pretty much it. And then they have other bits and pieces depending on circumstances, but that tends to be the core, but it's not really an ideology, not in the sense that we're used to understanding the term when we study the Soviet Union.
One more aspect that's stressed by GPT chat, it's the cult of personality and strong leadership in both areas. There was a strong emphasis on charismatic leadership, as you already told, and a cult of personality around the leaders. Adolf Hitler in Germany and Vladimir Putin in modern Russia both cultivated a strong and dominant image, projecting themselves as the decisive leaders. In this point of view, I wanted to ask you the question that we here in Ukraine are trying to, it's arguable very much, because when some good Russians say that it's just Putin, it's not society, but other experts, for example, from Eastern Europe, our colleagues from different other countries say that no, there's a mutual guilt because the society gave the power to Putin through all these 24 actually almost 24 years. So year by year, his period as a president, then prime minister, and then again president, they gave him much more power to decide to be like who? Like Tsar, like who imagines him in this situation? And is it the mutual guilt? How do you think this so-called the cult of personality in this situation for Russia?
Well, again, generally speaking, I'm in agreement with what you're saying. I would just add a few nuances. One is when it comes to starting the war, clearly Putin and his inner circle bear the vast majority of the responsibility and the guilt. Putin made the decision, apparently pretty much on his own, together with a few of his advisors. There may even have been some opposition within the FSB and the general staff. So in any case, he bears the primary responsibility for starting the war. That said, he's not the only one on the battlefield. There are hundreds and thousands of Russians fighting the war. There are possibly tens of thousands who have engaged in various kinds of atrocities. The Russians, again, I understand the difficulty and the complexity and the choices that Russians have to make when they're drafted for the war. Do they stay? Do they join? Do they run away? Do they hide? Do they go to prison? But the bottom line is the vast majority have, in fact, permitted themselves to be drafted. They are fighting on the battlefront, sometimes with great enthusiasm, sometimes with less enthusiasm. They are making the war possible. They are making the continuation of the war possible. And like it or not, the mere fact that they are fighting on the side of Putin makes them responsible for the war. Perhaps not guilty in the sense that Putin is, but certainly responsible. And of course, those who are killing civilians, who engage in atrocities, are also guilty of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, as well as of genocide. More generally, you're absolutely right to say that Putin has enjoyed enormous popularity amongst the Russian population virtually from the very first day that he came into office. His ratings have been somewhere between 65 and 85% from the very beginning. So there's no avoiding the conclusion that he is, in fact, a popular fascist dictator. But of course, so was Mussolini. And of course, so was Hitler. And if we're going to be consistent, and we should be, we argue always that the Germans bear some responsibility, indeed some guilt, and certainly some responsibility for Hitler's crimes. We say the same about the Italians. And we should, for the sake of logical consistency as well as moral consistency, say the same about Russians. They bear responsibility for the fascist regime. They bear responsibility for the actions of the fascist regime, for its genocide in Chechnya, for its invasion of Georgia, for its invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, like it or not, Russians bear responsibility for the behavior, for the actions of this regime. Now, if the regime had not been popular, if Putin's ratings were always 10 or 15%, then one could argue legitimately that the Russians had no choice, that they didn't perhaps support the regime, but because of the coercion and the violence, they were afraid, something like that. And we could give them the benefit of the doubt. But when 85% support Putin consistently.
И мы видим, как героически действуют и воюют наши ребята в ходе этой операции.
Very tragically, but still ironic, the usage of this Z letter. And I want to quote Jonathan Katz at the German Marshall Fund. He writes, like the Nazis' use of the swastika as a symbol of power, Putin is using the letter Z as a symbol to rely Russians and to justify unconscionable actions in Ukraine. In the end, history will view Putin and his regime as war criminals, just like Hitler and the Nazis. So my question is, in this parallel, what future may await for Putin and what may intervene in it? Business as usual or something else? How do you think?
Well, Putin, again, we need to be clear about what he's guilty of. He's guilty of imperialism. He's guilty of war crimes against humanity, but he's also guilty of genocide. And that needs to be emphasized. So a whole range of criminal activities can be ascribed to Putin, but not just to Putin, because Lavrov, Naryshkin, and many of these other individuals are equal. Patrushev, of course, they're also responsible. Not just responsible, but they're guilty. And of course, those Russian soldiers who committed atrocities, who bombed Ukrainian hospitals, kindergartens, civilian targets, they too are guilty, not just of war crimes, but of genocide. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, what is his future? Again, it's perfectly possible that he will be removed from power by a coup d'etat initiated by disgruntled Russian elites. That argument has been made by many Russian analysts, it's been made by Ukrainian analysts, it's been made by Western analysts, including myself. So it's not inconceivable, and indeed perfectly possible, that given the appropriate circumstances, for instance, a major Ukrainian victory, either on the battlefield or in the war, could lead to a coup d'etat, a putsch, and a removal of Putin. And under those circumstances, he could conceivably be killed. This happens very often in coups. Or alternatively, he could be arrested and blamed for all of the atrocities and criminal activities that his regime engaged in. And not only blamed by the West, not only blamed by Ukrainians, but also by Russians, because they will be looking for a convenient scapegoat. And one can easily imagine generals, Chekists, and many others saying, we were okay, we were clean, this wasn't our fault, this wasn't our war. Blame it all on this evil man called Putin, blame it all on Lavrov, and so on. And in that case, his fate is likely to end up in The Hague with the willing participation of Russian elites. Alternatively, if Russia loses the war, or I should say, when Russia loses the war, because it will lose the war, regardless of who ends up in power in the Kremlin, Putin is likely to end up at The Hague as well, unless, of course, he commits suicide or finds some refuge in North Korea, China, or Iran. Those might be the only countries willing to take him in. So my sense personally is that sooner or later, almost regardless of the scenario, regardless of what happens, Putin will end up on some criminal bench facing the court, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The only exception to this would be if Russia wins or manages to hold off the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and under those sorts of circumstances, and I think that's extremely unlikely, then Putin, of course, will be able to present himself as an all-powerful leader.
And actually extremely unlike, as you said right now, that he will commit suicide, because from what we see, how he's afraid to die in any cases from COVID or from assassination or whatever, he's preserved very much. So it shows that he don't want to die. But anyways, from the point of view of trial, as you said, how far his guilt may go through the history, because I want to remind a little bit that the war against Ukraine began in 2014, and even then it would be possible for the world to somehow stop this Russian imperialism. But Ukraine is not the only country affected by Russia. In August 2008, the Russian-Georgian War began, which Michael Emerson called the first war of the 21st century in Europe. Was it possible to stop Putin and the Kremlin then? How do you think? And or who is to blame for the second stage of war in Georgia? Because I want to remind you that the first one was Abkhazia. And it wasn't Putin, it was Yeltsin. But still, the international society just closed eyes and didn't look up to the history of the Second World War and of the Reagan regime of Hitler. It wasn't the time, like now we are discussing the peculiarities of these two regimes. But who is to blame for that period? And was it the time when we could stop this and there wasn't war in Ukraine right now?
I mean, yes. I mean, the answer, the simple answer is yes, it could have been prevented. Unfortunately, of course, it wasn't. And it wasn't because neither Europe nor the United States took Putin and his regime seriously, or seriously enough. It was always the case that the regime was considered to be, authoritarian. But the explanation for the authoritarian regime was, this is what the Russians want. So Putin is simply doing what the Russians want. This is part of Russian culture, and that's arguably the case. But the ultimate effect of this kind of thinking was to make Putin somewhat benign. He wasn't quite the evil monster that he's turned out to be. So there was that problem. Sort of a underestimation of Putin, of his goals, of his regime. and the continuation of the belief that somehow one can talk to him, that he's basically a normal leader, perhaps authoritarian, but normal. But more important, perhaps, or at least equally important, was the fact that the West never really had a coherent policy toward the non-Russian nations of the former Soviet Union. With the Baltics were the exception, right? But it didn't have a policy toward Ukraine. It didn't have a policy toward Belarus. It didn't have a policy toward Central Asia. It never fully considered them to be truly important and worthy of a policy. Again, I know this from personal experience from the very beginning, since the Soviet Union collapsed. My colleagues, my friends, and I have been incessantly arguing at conferences and papers and articles and columns that the West needs to take Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asia, Georgia seriously, that it needs to have a coherent policy, that you can't just focus on Russia. And it never made any difference. It was like talking to a wall. Yes, these countries were interesting, but they weren't really important. And as you know, there are still some people who argue that Ukraine isn't really important. The only really important country is Russia. But partly because of that, or at least to a large degree because of the absence of such a policy, Putin could do things and people would say, well, it's just Putin. Well, it's just the Russians. And besides, it doesn't really matter. Georgia doesn't matter. Moldova doesn't matter. The Chechens don't matter. The Ukrainians, well, they're Russians anyway. They don't matter. And then suddenly realize in 2022 that they do matter. But unfortunately, until then, there hadn't been a policy in place. And we see this very clearly, for instance, in the decision to enlarge NATO. When the Poles, the Hungarians, and even the Romanians and Bulgarians and the Baltic states were admitted, I personally thought that was a mistake for two reasons. I believe that in admitting those countries, but failing to admit Belarus and Ukraine, the West would be creating a kind of a gray zone between the West and Russia, a kind of impossible no man's land within which Ukraine, Belarus, and the other non-Russians would continue to exist. And in expanding, but not going any further, essentially the West would be telling Russia, we're not interested in Ukraine and Belarus. You do with them whatever you like. And of course, the response on the part of Ukrainian leaders was to have this kind of multi-vector policy. They were trying to balance both sides because that was all they could do. And eventually, Ukraine decided to opt for the West. Belarus decided to opt for closer relations with Russia. But in both cases, they became much more vulnerable to Russian influence because of the decision to enlarge NATO, but not to encompass Ukraine and Belarus. Had NATO enlarged in the early 2000s when Poland and Hungary were admitted, or had it enlarged in 2008, there would have been no war. Russia was in no position to invade. Its armed forces were in terrible condition, even worse than today. NATO was much stronger and much unified. And yes, the Russians would have been upset. And yes, the Russians would have been shouting and screaming bloody murder. But they couldn't have done anything about Ukraine's membership. So the West could have prevented the war by taking Ukraine seriously, by either incorporating Ukraine in NATO or not enlarging NATO. Either of those solutions would have been adequate for Ukraine, but the West failed to do that because it did not take Ukraine seriously. And it's only now that it's actually taking Ukraine seriously, and that'll make a big difference. But unfortunately, the price that Ukraine has to pay is war. That could have been avoided.
One more very tough question. So a lot of experts and historians nowadays look back into the history and remember the first barbarian action of Nazi Germany. It happened on 10th of November in 1938 when over several days at least 70 German Jews were killed while thousands more were assaulted, arrested and just killed. So British newspapers at that time condemned this action of atrocity and called it just the actions like the furious since dark ages, actually. But afterwards there was a sign of Munich agreement, and afterwards there was war. And afterwards, let's get back to our era and to nowadays. And we understand after all this sign of, oh, let's not let Putin make something worse. Let's remember the latest situation with the Kakhovska dam that was destroyed by Russians, that brought to a lot of consequences, not only for Ukraine, but for the European continent. And next aggression might come from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So what else should happen here on the Ukrainian territory to make our international allies react beforehand to stop this situation before it will bring to another drama and tragic situation for not the whole continent, half of the planets, for example?
Well, my hope is that the Western policymakers have learned something, because back in January of 2022, most of them simply couldn't envision this kind of war, this kind of genocide, this kind of brutality, these kinds of atrocities. And of course, now they've transpired, now they've happened, and we've been living in a condition of genocide and brutality for over, close to a year and a half. So they certainly learned, or they should have learned, that the Russian regime is capable of, virtually anything. And just as the regime was capable of destroying the Kakhovka Dam and unleashing death and destruction on not just Ukrainians on the right bank, but Ukrainians on the left bank, which are theoretically their citizens. They also destroyed their own army, at least to some degree, in flooding. So clearly they have no regard whatsoever. That is to say, the regime has no regard whatsoever for human life, whether it's Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, or anything else. They do not care. And that means, of course, that it is perfectly possible now that they could blow up the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Why not? Once you've blown up a dam and shown your indifference to the fate of millions of people, why not up the ante? Why not increase the pressure? And of course, this also leads many people to fear that, going this far, the Russian regime might also be increasingly inclined to use tactical nuclear weapons. As you know, a week or so ago, Sergei Karaganov argued for the use of tactical nuclear weapons, as did Dmitry Ksenia. So this isn't just, some crazy Medvedev arguing in this manner. This is, serious people who are beginning to speak, who are speaking in a way that should terrify the whole world, not just Ukrainians, but the whole world. Now, what that means is that the world the world and the West in particular needs to respond in a very hard and harsh manner. It's no longer enough simply to say, you shouldn't do this. This is bad for the world. Russia needs to be told in no uncertain terms that if it engages in any kind of nuclear activity, whether it's the destruction of the power plant or whether it's the use of a nuclear weapon, that the response will be immediate and catastrophic. Now, Anthony Blinken, as well as Jake Sullivan, have made that point to the Russian leadership. It seems to be the case that the Chinese have also told Russia in no uncertain terms that they should not use nuclear weapons. But that point needs to be made over and over and over again. And it needs to be clarified. And the Russians need to understand just what catastrophic means. It's not sufficient simply to say, well, the consequences will be catastrophic. We need to tell the Russians that if they behave in this kind of manner, the United States, West, whoever, will respond by sending hundreds or thousands of cruise missiles to destroy armies, ports, whatever. And, you know, the general idea is that these should be conventional weapons and not nuclear weapons, but it has to be made clear, you will lose your army. Your army will be completely destroyed if you do this. So if you want to do this, remember, you will be without an army. That needs to be made clear, because otherwise, people like Karaganov, Putin, Medvedev will say, well, the West is just talking. No, they need to be very specific about what the consequences of this kind of madness will be.
If Russians don't care about the consequences of this tragical possibility, it's interesting why still several neighboring countries, for example, let's say about Hungary, still do not, or making poker face that do not understand all the possible circumstances that will bring by these actions by Russians, and trying to help somehow to preserve Russian regime in their actions. So let's talk about Hungary a little bit. The latest action by Orban, it's the transfer of prisoners of war that can only take place after the country of origin has been informed, and Hungary has violated international humanitarian law in this context. So this was stated by the Verkhovna Rada Commissioner of Human Rights, Dmytro Lubinets. He emphasized that prisoners of war can be transferred only after the country where they come from has been informed. When the Russian side transferred, according to our data, 11 prisoners of war, citizens of Ukraine, to the territory of Hungary without informing Ukraine, we're used to the fact that the Russians violate everything that is accepted in the world, but that a country that is a member of the European Union and NATO can do this so openly and deliberately, for sure it was a surprise, and surprise for us, the ombudsman said. And then Lubinets noted that he appealed to the Hungarian ombudsman to check the conditions of the Ukrainians' stay, but he hasn't yet received any answer. In addition, Ukrainian diplomats are not allowed to visit the prisoners handed over to Hungary. Their circle of communication is limited. They are not given mobile phones to inform their relatives and that they are safe. So in this situation, I want to ask you, what is the line of behavior of Orban? Is it Hungary as a whole, or is just Orban? What's his aim in this? And how Ukraine should react, how European Union should react on this?
Well, you know, the response on the part of Ukraine, I'm not exactly sure what Ukraine can do, given the fact that it's waging a war. So aside from diplomatic protests and the like, that's probably the extent. This is really a job for the European Union, because, of course, Orban isn't just violating international law in this particular instance. He's been violating European Union rules and regulations for the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, he's essentially trying to make Hungary into a more or less authoritarian, or indeed possibly a fully authoritarian state. He's been violating rule of law. He's been violating the independence of the media, independence of the courts. And unfortunately, the European Union has no easy mechanisms for dealing with those sorts of circumstances. They cannot threaten to evict Hungary because there's no mechanism for doing that. So they can threaten Hungary with with cutbacks in terms of assistance and so on. But even that's problematic because that usually requires a unanimous decision by a European Union institution. And the Hungarians will obviously not support this, and very often so do the Poles. They happen not to support this. So it becomes a very difficult problem, but it's a problem for the European Union. The European Union has to figure out a way in which it can deal with countries that are technically technically or in fact in spirit as well as in letter in violation of European Union rules and regulations. Same is true for NATO. But of course, typically for Orban, he's doing it in a manner that also happens to violate international law.
Mm-hmm. So to conclude our conversation, I want to put you, maybe it's a difficult question, but still I want to try to understand. So from what we talked about right now, how do you think Putin is the new Hitler, or actually he's more new Stalin? Because if we look to his attitude towards his own population, it's mostly like Stalin's behavior and actions. So maybe Hitler and Stalin in one phase anyways. What outcome is worthy of such a historical example of inheritance in the 21st century, and how the world security architecture will look after this all ends?
Well, I would say that the Putin is much more like Hitler, for all the reasons I've already mentioned. The Russian Federation resembles Nazi Germany. Russian ideology resembles Nazi ideology. Putin resembles Hitler in terms of his antics, in terms of his behavior, and so on. I mean, so I could go on in that regard. But I think the comparison with Nazi Germany is much more appropriate. That's not to say that one can't compare Hitler with Stalin. One can, of course, but it's just Hitler really comes to mind, and Mussolini perhaps even more. So I would focus, as we began this discussion with the conversation on Russism, and I think the fascist angle, the fascist point of view, is something we need to keep in mind here. In terms of what the implications of all this will be for security, well, if, as I believe, Ukraine will win, and if, as I also believe, the Putin regime will collapse, and the Russian Federation will either become much weaker or perhaps even fall apart, then whatever the circumstances, Russia will no longer be quite the great power it claims to be. It will still have nuclear weapons, and it will presumably still have a seat on the United Nations Security Council, but it won't be considered a great power by anyone anymore. In contrast, Ukraine will become not exactly a great power, but a regional player. It will become much more important for the security architecture of Europe and possibly of Eurasia as well. Whether that's good or bad news for Ukraine, I don't know, but it will change significantly the way in which alliances are formed. Countries like China, countries like Iran, countries like India, and of course the European Union will have to be much more attentive to Ukraine. And in contrast, Russia, whatever its circumstances, is likely to become much more of a supplier of mineral resources, sort of a backward, underdeveloped country which provides coal, oil, and gas, and isn't quite fully integrated with the international community. So one can see major changes taking place if and when Ukraine wins and if and when Russia loses.
Yeah, when Ukraine wins and when Putin will be stopped. So at this point, yeah, thank you. I want to thank you for this interesting conversation. And I want to remind that our guest was Alexander Motyl, a professor of political science at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, and a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and Soviet Union, and as well a historian. Thank you very much for this lesson of history as well. So now I want to thank all of you for your time being with us. I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and it's my show. Talk for more details, so join the gaze next time, and thank you for your trust. See ya.